Hello, it's Aaron Renn. Welcome back to the podcast. My guest today is Dr. John Seel. He's been on the show before. I don't know if he knows this, but our previous podcast was extremely popular, got way more views than usual on YouTube. He's contributed to my site on a number of issues. He has a PhD in American Studies from the University of Maryland, I believe, and does a lot of work with organizations on understanding culture. And he also, interestingly, used to work for both James Davison Hunter, the University of Virginia sociologist, and Os Guinness, who you know was also a guest on the show. So Dr. Seel, is joining me today to talk about masculinity. So, John, thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much, Aaron.
Now, I'm doing it differently today than I would normally do. Normally, I have a book or an article or a specific topic laid out, and I actually do some preparation for these podcasts, believe it or not. I write down a bunch of questions and usually send them to the guest, but I didn't do that today. You had reached out to me thinking about this issue, and so I said, we're just going to make this more banter style. I'm going to kick it
Hmm.
off and then we'll see where it goes. We'll see where it goes. So
Right.
first of all, before we dig into the masculinity issue, I want to ask you what it was like working for James Davison Hunter and Os Guinness, who are both fairly big figures out there in the world of my readers.
Well, I'm a protege of both. In other words, uh, James is a little younger than I am, and Oz is a little older, but I was heavily influenced by both of them. The commonality in both of them intellectually is they're both beholden to the work of Peter Berger. And so they share in common what in academic speak is phenomenological sociology of Berger. And I was interested in that in particular. And initially, I got connected to Oz because of my connection with Labrie. I first met Oz at the 1972 Labrie conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee, in Covenant College. Um, but we became good friends, and I worked for him for about 15 years. And then in the process of finishing my doctorate, I became aware of Hunter's work, and I met him at over lunch at the faculty club at University of Virginia, where I went to attend a conference on, I think it was the epistemology of science, um, and we became very good friends. He was on my doctoral committee. He was the outside reader on my dissertation. He was the best man in my wedding, and I
Oh
climbed
wow,
Mount Rainier. And I climbed Mount Rainier with him. So
wow.
I'm I'm heavily beholden to James, um, and 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 tend to follow probably James a little more than Oz these days. Oz is slightly more politically oriented, and James is less so, although he writes about politics, but he keeps a kind of neutral academic distance because of his professional role at University of Virginia, which is an occupational requirement,
Yeah.
um, or at least it is in his mind. And so uh, both are visionaries. Um, what I have tended to do is to put legs on visions. In other words, I help visionaries who are really good at big ideas institutionalize their ideas. And so I helped create the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture. I helped Oz create the Trinity Forum. And so I was the operational person behind
Hmm.
their visionary leadership. So um, they're great people. Um, I think Oz eventually wanted to be more of a writer than an institution person. Um, James is much more of an introvert than Oz is.
Hmm.
Um, the fact that James has created the infrastructure around the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture when none of that institution building is really in his gift set is remarkable. I mean, I
Hmm.
give him highest praise for what he's accomplished there and what he continues to do through Hedgehog and the influence of the Institute.
Yeah, Hedgehog Review is his magazine down there, which is a great little
That's right.
magazine. Yeah, I
That's
don't
right.
know Oz Guinness as well. I haven't read as much of his stuff. I've read quite a bit of Hunter, and he's brilliant. You know, it's sort of like I think I have some great insight into the church, and I'm feeling very proud of myself. And then I read his book from 1982, and like he already said that point back then. You know, it's like
Okay.
wow. You know, it's like, why didn't I read this earlier, kind of thing.
Right. Mhm.
So that's great
Yeah,
stuff
he
there.
is a really deep thinker, and well, James can write books that I have trouble reading because they're so academic.
Hmm.
I mean, his book that he wrote with Ned Nedleski on science and the epistemology of science was really deep
I didn't
academic
read that one.
work. Well,
Yeah,
it's
yeah. There's a
it
few of them
is
in the middle that I haven't read.
um, really deep work. Well, I read everything that James does, and he writes. I mean, I think this last book is probably as significant as Culture Wars
Hmm.
in that he actually, now in the book, which would be typically James, he doesn't actually say definitively what his conclusions are. He wrote an essay in Hedgehog in which he basically said, well, the shared common culture in America today is nihilism. And the fact is that the chances of democracy surviving our current situation are very low.
Hmm.
So he is as now. He is as pessimistic about our situation, or as realistic, depending on your perspective, as anybody. But I think that he is pointing out the fact that we are at a major cultural inflection moment. In other words, I think well, my take is my entire career has basically been the study of modernity. It started with Berger and modernity, and then it moved into Hunter and postmodernity. And the postmodernity project was the precursor to the Institute. And now we're at the situation where we're at postmodernity, which is basically nihilism, and basically modernity is unraveling. That is, all the things, or put it another way, the Enlightenment project is unraveling. There are two aspects of modernity. You have the ideas and the institutions. And the ideas are what's unraveling. The institutions, namely technology, are accelerating. So we have this odd situation where the technologies of modernity are exploding and the ideas of modernity are imploding.
Hmm.
And we're living in that moment. And it's extraordinarily interesting, but it means that basically Western civilization, hybrid American, even hybrid American republic, Republican democracy, is a cut flower from its pre-modern roots in the Middle Ages, and now that flower is withering, and we're living in the withering. So we see all the things like the random violence, the wilding in Cincinnati, this couple that got just beat up by this gang, and everybody's taking pictures and nobody's doing anything, and nobody calls 911, and there are no ambulances, and our default is to say, hey, we have a political problem. The fact is, we don't have a political problem. We actually have a cultural problem. This is symptoms of what it looks like to live in nihilism.
Yeah, which you really said something that I hadn't thought about, which is we do have these two strains of what we feel is a sort of social unraveling, collapsing kind of
Right, right.
political institutions, social cohesion, but we're having technological acceleration, isn't it? So technology continues to accelerate. We have electric vehicles, driverless cars, artificial intelligence. We're now curing diseases like cystic fibrosis by editing people's genes, and there's a lot of crazy things. I don't know. We're gonna thinking about that, and we always associate sort of cultural, social decline with technological decline, economic
Well,
decline.
let me ask you,
Maybe it'll
what is the
produce
one,
that.
what's the one word that comes to mind when you think of Nietzschean nihilism?
Uh, the Ubermensch. I don't know.
Power,
Power. Yeah.
will to power.
Yeah.
What is the greatest example of the potential for will to power today? Technology in AI.
Right.
And AI is a significant big deal. Or
Well,
put it
there's no
this
doubt
way,
about that.
it's not like any other technological thing that we have seen come down the path. This is not, I mean, this is not exactly like the printing press. This is closer to something like fire. I mean,
I
it's
don't think it's.
really, it's a big deal, and I think its implications are going to be significant. But what's interesting is all the things that relate to the word power are functionally nihilistic and functionally Nietzschean, and they are accelerating.
Now,
Now
that may be true in
now
our society. I don't know that I'm convinced that power is an inherently Nietzschean concept, in a sense, or authority, whatever you may think about it. I think there's been like a tremendous uh, attempt by certain people within the church, certain individuals, to basically delegitimize power. It's very Anabaptist. It's like power is inherently bad. And I'm
well,
not sure that I
if
agree with that completely.
oh, I totally agree with you on your
Yeah.
analysis. In other words, power is not inherently bad. In fact, it's inevitable. The question is the sources of power and the ends of power. And that's where we're living in a society where um, authority has been reduced to the subjective self with expressive individualism, coupled with uh, an erosion of any external authority. So, in the Bible, it was every man, was right in his own eyes. And then we add to that high powered technology. And it's a very volatile and it's a volatile situation and unstable. In other
Hmm.
words, we're in a moment fraught with the potential of a black swan event, which will, now COVID was a black swan event, but the potential for more deadly and disruptive black swan events are all around us.
Oh, yeah. We have no
So,
idea like what's lurking out there, but we know it's a
so,
very disruptive time.
so we say we read in the paper today that Trump has moved forward 2 nuclear submarines to be right off the coast of Russia, and we take that as page B in the newspaper.
Right.
I mean, it's
Well, I definitely think for just militarily, the United States, the lesson that the United States has taken away from, say, the last 25 years is that we can do anything we want to anybody and get away with it. I mean, we had to leave Afghanistan with our tail between our legs and things like that, but the United States has not paid a price for anything that it has done internationally. And in fact, it seems to have only enhanced our power. And so I fear that, like, every time some other country is restrained in their response to something we do, the lesson we take from that is we can do literally anything we want and get away with it until we can't. And that's the one that I think is, kind of concerning to me personally.
of course the tariffs are a tool of economic imperialism. That's what we're seeing. It's economic imperialism, not military colonialism or military expansion. It's economic. In fact, Trump has this mixture of being a peacemaker, but using tariffs for economic imperialism.
And we've been doing that since, I mean, it's not just tariffs, it's sanctions regime, access to the dollar financial system. We've been
Oh,
leveraging economic power for quite some time. Tariffs are just the new. I think originally the free trade regime itself was an instrument of American imperial power. Now that
that's right.
that's sort of reached the end of its usefulness, we're moving on to the
Right.
next thing.
Right. The point being is that
Yeah.
the level of the VUCA, the term VUCA. Uh, VUCA is volatile, unstable, or uncertain, and ambiguous. And we're in a state where reality is just a lot more fragile, and we need to be a lot more attentive. I think as followers of Christ, the thing about it is that I tend to think that we, as the church, always tend to think that things are always going to go on the way they always have been. And I think we're in as I said in my previous podcast with you, we're not in a age of change, but we're in a change of age. And I think that Hunter in particular has put his finger on that fact as it relates to American democracy.
What's the old quip? There's, decades in which nothing happens and then weeks in which decades happen. And it's like, boom, all of a sudden there's this breaking point that nobody thinks will ever come. Maybe it won't come. I think that's the problem. I do think, like, with like Republicans crying wolf over the debt since the 1980s. And if you told somebody 30 years ago we have almost $40 trillion in debt, they would have said, he hyperinflated, society collapsed, but it didn't. And so, again, the lesson we took away is this stuff just doesn't matter, and eventually it will matter. But I think too much we cried wolf. To be honest, we cried wolf a lot, and that is a big part of our problem. And now
Yeah.
we've sort of woken up from that. But I agree with Hunter. I think his book Democracy and Solidarity maybe I'll throw a link to it and the podcast I did with him about the book and the article I wrote about the book in the show notes here. It's very important thinking about it. It's interesting you mentioned Peter Berger too. He was also a renowned sociologist. I think maybe he was a dissertation advisor to Hunter. Is that true? Didn't Hunter get his dissertation under Berger?
Yes.
Yeah,
Oz did his dissertation on Berger.
yeah.
Hunter did his dissertation under Berger at
Okay.
Rutgers.
So Peter Berger, who was, kind of a Lutheran Christian guy, very
Mhm.
involved in creating the social construction of knowledge movement in sociology. So very influential within his field. Did work on desecularization. I started reading him in the very last years of his life, and he seemed like a very interesting guy. But I haven't gone back and read much of his work, but clearly somebody who cast a long shadow
Yeah,
in terms
he
of
was very
influence.
influential on a generation,
Yeah,
for sure. And uh, and in the social sciences, basically conservative.
yeah,
I mean, there's no field in academia that's least conservative than the social sciences, but he was basically conservative.
yeah. He was
Uh,
on the board of First Things magazine for a while, so he was actually palled around with actual conservative people.
he
Which
was
I don't
best
know.
best friends with Newhouse.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
Newhouse was good at making friends. I think it was one
Yes.
of his superpowers. He was,
Uh,
and of course I never got to meet him, but anyhow, that's a kind of interesting background about you in the kind of cultural context. I want to zero in on masculinity and where does masculinity and the crisis that we hear so much about this. What is it, and how does it kind of relate to some of the stuff we've been talking about?
well, it's a headwater issue. In other words, as I've gotten older, I realize I don't have a whole lot of runway, so I have to pick things that actually matter, topics that matter. And so you ask questions, what is upstream? Well, we've argued repeatedly, you've heard me argue repeatedly that culture is upstream from politics, and religion is upstream from culture. And and so when you're talking about headwater issues, it means you want to get back to the core causal factors from which a lot of downstream problems emerge. In other words, if you're trying to deal with pollution in the Mississippi, it's a lot easier to deal with the problem at Lake Itasca in Minnesota, which is the headwaters of the Mississippi, than in New Orleans. Uh, in fact, at Lake Itasca, the Mississippi exits the lake to the north, actually, and then it loops south. But there are stones on which you can basically step across the stream at that point. That is the headwaters of the Mississippi. Now, I realized that the family, if you're dealing with culture, the family is central to the dynamics of culture and civilization and society, and the father and or the male figure in a family is central to the family. And then it became quite apparent we have a social collapse, we have a familial collapse, we have a collapse of marriage or its rationale, and behind this we have this growing crisis of masculinity, which is, apart from you and Richard Reeves, very few people realize what a serious problem it is. In fact, the public narrative is that we can't actually identify it as a problem because it's actually viewed as a feminist problem, not a male problem, as you articulated in one of your recent blogs. The point being is you can't even identify it as a problem. When I told somebody I was writing this book on an airplane, the woman said, "What, you want me to feel sorry for men?" In other words, which would be a typical kind of reaction. But I realized that this is a very significant problem. And as I looked at it, I realized that how you frame the problem determines how you address the problem. And it's framed as a feminist problem by the media.
What do you mean by a
A ma-
feminist problem? Can you just explain that for a minute before we?
well, it means that the problem with men is that they cause problems for women. Is that men basically uh, all the problems with men are basically a function of the fact that they are a burden to women, and the problems is always seen through the feminist lens, which you've written about. The church, ironically, takes the opposite tact and says it's basically a male problem, and they always want to frame the problem in terms of all the dysfunctions of masculinity. And as you've rightly critiqued, their approach is to feminize masculinity as a response to seeing it as a male problem and not allowing men to actually be men. And that's a problem in itself. And then, of course, the manosphere's approach is just to take the reaction to the masculine reaction and then to pump it up on steroids, often in quite derogatory kind of or negative kind of ways. And I was concerned. In other words, there's a particular book I'm thinking of, and every chapter of the book was defined by a male problem. We have a chapter on anger. We have a chapter on lust. We have a chapter on passivity. We have a chapter, in other words, give me your top 10 male problems, and I'll write a chapter on each one of them. Now, inevitably, the overarching frame about masculinity is you are a series of problems and you need some significant behavioral modification. And that irritated me because nobody is framing masculinity in terms of its ideal or as a positive, a social good. I mean, as something that is idealistic. And if you want to get back to some kind of idealism of masculinity, you got to go back to Victorian historical anomalies like Jane Austen, etc. I mean, you got to go way back before you end up with chivalry being celebrated or masculine traits being celebrated. And that got me thinking about this problem. First of all, it's a Headwater issue. It's a big problem socially, culturally. I think the framing is off. And so then I asked the question, well, what does it mean to be a man? And if we know that the question, what does it mean to be a woman, was not able to be answered, and nobody in the Supreme Court or in Congress was willing to answer that question. Well, if it's a problem, if you can't answer that question, it's even a bigger problem for men because male identity is actually a social construct, much more fragile than women's identity. The reason women's identity is less fragile is that there are aspects of women's identity that are intrinsically embodied, whereas the male identity is related to its function within the community, which is why in every society historically, there has been a big to-do over a celebration which identifies you as moving from being a boy to a man. Because we have to affirm that process and affirm those characteristics. So it's much more fragile. So to be cavalier about gender is a big problem for masculinity. And of course, if you basically say, we don't know what a woman is, you're basically saying we don't know what a man is. And if you say you have a masculine problem, what we're actually saying is you actually don't have a masculine problem because you don't have a masculine gender, because gender itself doesn't matter. And all of a sudden the problem gets erased. In fact, it doesn't actually get erased, it just gets buried, but we don't have even a language by which to even describe or talk about it. Now, that got me thinking, how do we develop our identity? What does it mean to have an identity itself, and how is identity formed? And basically, there are historically three approaches. There's the contemporary postmodern approach, which is you invent it. You design your own identity. And the fullest expression of that culturally is, of course, the trans movement. So biology doesn't make any difference. Reality doesn't make any difference. It's all ultimately your identity is a social construct of your own choosing. But that approach, which is the postmodern approach, is ubiquitous everywhere. Probably the leading spokesperson for that view is Taylor Swift. Now, she's not a big philosopher, but let's just say she has a lot of cultural capital. And so that view is not insignificant. Now, many Christians are aware that that is a bridge too far, and for lots of reasons, they are not willing to say you design your own identity. And so they fall back on a modernist view, which is the older view, and that is you discover it. And we will give you some tests and personality profile tests, or we'll give you an Enneagram test, and we'll give you whatever kinds of tests, but you will discover the confluence of what your identity is. Now, that's more scientific, less subjective, heavily reductionistic, and depersonalizing, but has the allure of science, has the allure of facticity that lots and lots of people get caught up. In fact, there's entire Christian ministries that have apps for your phone that you can punch in and answer a bunch of questions and find out, who you are. Now, I don't think that's a biblical understanding of identity at all. And I think the third approach is the one that I think is the least discussed, but it has to do with our identity is derived by an ongoing relationship we have with God himself. And all the other approaches are a secular approach, meaning that somehow we can figure out who we are without any relationship with God. Now, it was Berger who I first heard say, if God is dead, any self is possible. If God is not dead, then our identity is rooted in who God says we are, and it comes with a plan and a purpose and a pattern and a power, actually. And so I have written a book on aspirational masculinity, which unpacks the spiritual potential of what it means to be a man. Because now, that is suggesting that gender is not enough. So simply the fact that I'm born male does not mean I actually have a secure identity. I am born male, but I become a man through a dependent relationship on God and living out of the resources that God provides in and through my life. Now, I'm not unaware that that's a fairly radical statement, because it basically says to be fully a man, you have to come to Christ and live out of the resources of Christ's life within. In other words, you have to be born again so that you have Christ's life within you. And in order to become fully man, you have to, and overcome the old Adam, you have to engage the new Adam so that you live out of that in your life. And that's, the book is simply unpacking the implications of personhood and identity rooted in Christ. Now, the original title of the book, heavily influenced by Rod Dreher, as you will identify, was Embodied Enchantment, meaning living out of Christ within you. It's like the word discipleship doesn't mean anything to you. But I said, to be fully human, you have to be enchanted by having Christ, the God of the universe, living his life in and through you. That gives you both a pattern, a presence, a purpose, and a power that you do not have in and of yourself. So to be fully man is to be fully dependent on God and his resources that enable you to be all that God intended for you to be. And if that's the case, then, now, I didn't realize this immediately, but it fell in place. Then our sense of calling and vocation is an externalization of my identity is rooted in is sourced in God himself, living his life within me. My calling is an externalization through my own personality of that and life experiences of that indwelling presence. My marriage then becomes a catalyst that enables me to more efficiently and fully embrace not only who I am, but what my calling is. It's a partnership in kingdom purposes. And marriage is a symbol of union with Christ. And so it comes right back to, and the reason, of course, there's no marriage in heaven is because in heaven, the reality of what marriage symbolizes is embodied in the fact that we are one with Christ and we're living out of the resources of Trinitarian presence within us. So, do you have to come to Christ in order to be fully a man? Yes. And do you have to learn to live out of the dependence on Christ in order to be fully a man? Yes. Or put another way, simply to focus on secondary roles like son, father, husband, or various behaviors, presence, protector, provider, procreator, are not insignificant. They're just not primary.
Now, I would say, listening to that, I'm totally with you on the framings. In fact, I love that, the idea of the three different ways the masculinity issues framed. I also like the ways about the identity construction. Now, I would put a little nuance personally on do you have to come to Christ to be fully a man? Now, obviously, the answer would be yes. To be fully who you are, you have to be operating as designed, which is for a relationship with God. So we can't just have no God and things are going to go well. I think I think that approach, it kind of in my view, is very uh, kind of in line with a little bit about how evangelicals think about the world in a sense, which is very creation light, grace heavy, and in this sense that it's like, do you need to have union with Christ to be fully a mother? Probably at some level, yes. But you could probably be a good mom, basically good mom by many, many, many dimensions, without being Christian. And so I feel like there is a sense in which there's a creation. You were created a certain way, and there are certain things that function a certain way in light of how they were created. And that it doesn't require, the fall does not totally obliterate uh, that sort of created. I don't like, like use the term natural law or all these things, but that's where I feel
Hmm.
like the church has a very weak, evangelical church has an extremely weak anthropology of gender. So in the complementarian system
Hmm.
that I've been a critic of, there's essentially no anthropology of gender. You
Hmm.
have, in essence, some nominal affirmation that men and women are pervasively different, but with no actual specifics about what that means. We focus in on a couple Bible verses here and there. And the idea is if we can't sort of source it to some direct Christian principle, Bible verse, we can't. They've never come up with a compelling description of manhood because it's totally rooted in this sort of uh, anthropology light, creation light view of the world. And I think that's why evangelicals punch so below their weight in society. There's no vision of the world and creation outside of that. I think there is a discovered element to masculine identity. I don't think you could totally like discern it through psychology. I do think the idea of like do your Myers Briggs and all that, which I loved taking all those tests, and I've taken all the industrial psych profiles known to man. Is that they're insightful, I think, in a lot of ways, but I think there is a discovered like the world functions according to certain principles, and there is a sense in which we discover those principles, and we discovered science, I think, precisely because of a high view of creation, and God created it, and it has certain attributes and elements, and therefore we can do that. And so I think there is sort of a creation rooted uh, element to masculinity, an anthropological masculinity that is, you know, is not by itself sufficient to obviously it's not sufficient to save, nor is it fully sufficient to be a complete man, to be fully actualized as a man. But I think there's an important element of that that we should acknowledge. I don't know what you think of that, but that's sort of the way I tend to approach the problem much more that way because I feel like that's the defect that the church has is its concept of these things is so minimalistic. It has nothing to say on gender because it has no anthropology of gender whatsoever. And I think it's kind of hard to derive an anthropology of gender from relationship with Christ because you could be a woman and have a relationship with Christ, you could be a man and have a relationship with Christ, but I don't see like how that directly says, okay, ergo this is that. There seems to be a missing step in there.
Well, first of all, I could not agree with you more on the critique of evangelical
Well,
church's
you can
weakness on
disagree with me
create.
too. Don't hesitate to
I,
do that.
I will. In other words, I do agree with the fact that we are very weak on creation. And I think um, as a consequence, we have a spirituality that tends to be heavily cognitive, disembodied, and oriented to the afterlife and not current life. So all that I agree with. So I'm a if we want to talk about a 4 chapter gospel, creation, fall, redemption, and restoration, I'm there. I'm also Kuyperian, knowing that Kuyper's emphasis was you actually look at the creational orb and you learn from it what are the patterns God instilled in creation for various spheres of creation, like politics or gender or marriage or all the rest, which was exactly the Kuyperian and Doryverdian tradition. And I come out of that realm. I do think, however, there is a mystical side that we have tended to overlook, and that is that we actually become a new kind of person when we come to Christ. That is, we are actually, we're not a better person of the old kind. We're a new kind of person, and we are living out of a whole new dynamic. And so, my view is to get back to creation because we have Genesis 3 or the fall. We need to come to creation, Genesis 1, through the cross and resurrection that allows us to fully embrace what God intended at the beginning. And that if we think that we can get back to the beginning without the cross and resurrection, mind you, note I consciously include the resurrection in the conversation, then I think that we end up to be blunt, secularizing the gospel. I think it's not living out of the overwhelming transformative potential of what it means to be living in Christ. And I think living in Christ is what gives us the dynamic to actually obey the patterns of creation and learn to love as Christ loved. Now, let me be the devil's advocate on myself. What's the potential weakness in my entire argument? And I don't think I have a real good answer to it either. I mean, I have a roundabout, but it's probably a B or a C answer to an A question. And that is, so I wrote a book, Aspirational Masculinity. And I wrote the book because we have a crisis of masculinity, and I think that is culturally, it's a big problem. And I also think it's a Headwater issue. And sociologically, disproportionately, men's role in the family has a huge impact, far away larger than the mother's. No matter how intentional or godly the mother is, the father's role unfairly supersedes all in sociological data. All right, here's the question. How much of the book would have to be changed to write a book, Aspirational Femininity?
Well, I think that was kind of my question from because when you
There
think of
it
it as
is. I know it is.
deriving from indwelling Christ, like men and women have a relationship with Christ. So I got that part. It's like just how does that? But I think you sort of answered the Kuyperianism. There has to be some content to masculinity that is restored in light of the gospel
That's right.
versus nature. And this is one thing that I got from the debates over Stephen Wolf's A Case for Christian Nationalism, which is not really that interesting to me in terms of a thing because I'm not a Christian nationalist. But this idea of grace versus grace and nature as categories, and it became very clear to me most modern evangelicals have no category of nature. Uh, Everything is grace. Even this idea of common grace, it's like that's a way to sort of graceify everything. Uh, and it's like I said, it's the question is, does a mother love her child because God created mothers to love their children? Or do mothers love their child because of common grace? Because, but for some special, you know, dispensation from God, she wouldn't love her children. And I think that seems to be six of one, half dozen of the other. But I think there are profound implications to how you answer that question. And that's where I feel like the idea that like we have to have some I don't like to use the term nature. It seems a little maybe too, I don't know, natural. It seems a little Catholic to me, but the idea of creation, there has to be some content to creation that exists because of how God designed it that may have certain deficiencies or defects due to the fall, but uh, grace is is sort of operating to restore that in some way. And of course, I think it also like some of this gets to your eschatology too, and I don't think there's like really good answers. The premillennialist says all things new mean this world is going to burn completely. It's going to get all turned into slag, gone. There's nothing here. God's just going to create something brand new. Now, if you have, so I think how you think about what happens, it really does have a fundamental view of how you think about the world. That's why no premillennialists ever build anything. This like that's durable. Why would you build a nice building when it's not going to be here very long? And so I feel like these questions have profound implications. They're like headwater issues, as you would say, that define how we think about the world. And so, like for me, paradigmatically, I've been thinking about creation a lot, and thinking about it in terms of vocation and work. Because prior to the fall, what is the only work we ever see being done in the garden? Adam naming the animals. That is the only work that is portrayed. And so we tend to think of them, cultivating plants or whatever. But the only work we're shown is Adam naming the animals, which is clearly his operate. God created the world through a structuring and ordering activity, the day and the night, the land, the sea, and the water. Now it's Adam is taking up that work of structuring and ordering the world. Naming is a classic structuring and ordering activity. Mm-hmm. And so to me, the idea that the man in the garden is engaged in this structuring and ordering activity is paradigmatic to what a man is supposed to be doing and paradigmatic to thinking about vocation. And then also, the way that it's portrayed, and again, it seems to be what, maybe Jordan Peterson or somebody would say, is like, it's a drama of father and son. I think if I were tasked with naming the animals, I think the average evangelical, the average evangelical in me would say, what do you do with that? Well, you pray to God. God, what do you want me to name these animals? That's sort of like, God, what do you want me to do? Tell me what to do. I do that. I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. In the Bible, it's reversed. God brings the animals to Adam and said, what do you want to name these animals, Adam? That's a complete inversion of everything that we think about in terms of like how this relationship should operate. It's just like your own son. You don't want him to simply carry out your instructions. You want to see what he's going to do in the world, and it's like you're excited when he does things. So there's something in there that I think you have to have some content to which, grace and the death and resurrection of Christ and the relationship with Christ gets applied to restore, like restoring the image of God and these things. And that's where I kind of come in at it.
Well, I don't disagree with any of that. I would say in terms of nature grace, to use the upper and lower story of Schaeffer, I want them on one story.
Whom I've never read, by the way, so you're like informing me.
So I want them on one story.
Hmm.
In other words, so nature has to be infused by grace, grace has to be infused by nature. I want them integrated. And my critique is that often what we end up with is all nature and no grace. And then we end up with a secularized understanding of identity. Most of the conversations that way. And my view is it's only as we live out of the indwelling presence of Christ that we are given the resources by which we can fulfill the purposes of Christ that he has designed for us in creation. But the fact is that whether it's the parable of the talents, there was agency,
Yeah.
there was entrepreneurial freedom given to the people. And when they didn't use their entrepreneurial agency, that was the error. And so, in fact, uh, we have to assume a much more responsibility for. Now, I don't disagree that your eschatology impacts this. I am of the opinion that our efforts in this world to make this world a better world will actually have enduring consequences in the world to come. In other words, that everything good will last, that everything that we have a redemptive influence in all creation that matters, and our efforts in our work and in our lives and in the creation around us matter, and that there is continuity between this earth and the new earth and new heavens. And so that does animate and inspire the backstory to some of this conversation. But I want to keep nature and grace. I don't disagree that we need nature. But if we have all the discussions about the characteristics of masculinity that we can derive sociologically, psychologically, culturally, etc., without incorporating a spiritual dimension of the fact that there is a mystical relationship we have with Christ living his life within us that gives us the ability, uniquely, the ability to live like Jesus, and that we cannot live like Jesus unless Jesus is living in us. So it's not simply a matter of getting us into heaven, it's about getting heaven into us so that we then reflect the life of Christ and we become, to quote Lewis, little Christ. But we do not become little Christ simply by being a man's man according to nature.
No, I mean, I would certainly agree with that. I love that you
Mm-hmm.
brought up the parable of the talents because that's another one that I don't think you could take a parable, which is trying to make a certain point, and like take every single aspect of the parable and turn it into a precept of God. But it is interesting again that much like God bringing the animals to Adam, the master gives his servants talents and then he leaves. He leaves. He's not giving any instructions. He's like,
No,
I'm expecting you to do something with this money. Which I get. I don't think evangelicals think like that,
I
at
agree.
all. There is a sense in which he's not radioing in the instructions uh, from remote. And so the other thing about that is
And
I think we
also,
have
I don't think you can find a Bible verse for all the instructions you're supposed to
right.
undertake.
No, I think
In other
that's
words,
that's part of our
so
problem.
in
you
other
know,
words, so when we are needing to have thoughtful biblical people actually involved at the highest level of the AI discussion. Now,
I
there's
can
going
tell
to
you
be
we
an
actually
anthropology.
do. I can't say anything else about that, but I know that there are some people.
There are some. There are. Um, and almost all the leadership of AI companies are heavily spiritually oriented. And not always in the best way, but they take spirituality seriously. They also have a sacramentalist understanding of consciousness, that consciousness can get infused in matter.
Not necessarily your body. They don't necessarily think it has to be your body, but
no, that's right. Well, no, in chips, in sand.
yeah. I think one of the things that, like, part of the I think I come down to is, and again, this also comes away from the Stephen Wolf discussion a little bit. Inspired. If you start saying things that are like gospel related or things of that nature, part of what we're implying is that non-Christians are sort of we have nothing to offer them. So it's like society. If you're the magistrate and I'm tasked, right, with advising the president of the United States or whomever on what we should do about our men problem, basically, if step one, you can't do anything unless you're a Christian, then the only advice I could give is you have to evangelize all these people first, or else we're not going to make any progress, which I don't think is true. It's like in Romans when Paul talks about the Gentiles who don't have the law and nevertheless fulfill it because their conscience is a law into their heart. I think there is an element in which people without Christ can better or worse fulfill aspects of the law, even if nothing that they can do can ultimately be pleasing to God due to the condition of their soul. So I think we have to have an answer to what would you advise the magistrate in light of this theory of masculinity. And that's where I think there's a challenge. It kind of breaks down a little bit when step one is always first become Christian, which of course for the individual, if you're talking to an individual man, of course I think that would be something you want to see. Of course you want to evangelize. You want them to be Christian. It's certainly critical to you. I agree with you completely. You can't be fully operating as a man, without that relationship with Christ. But there has to be like some. I don't know that we could just. It's almost like a Christ against culture model in that sense, where it's kind of like, well, peace out from what's going out over here. We're just going to go do our thing over here.
Well, it's
sort of like when you say. I'll do the other example is, if racial reconciliation is a gospel issue, then it only applies inside of the church, because the people outside of the church don't have the gospel, and so but. Obviously, it's much more than a gospel issue. It's a social issue. It's an issue in the world at large. And so we have to have an answer for what happens. I think the gospel issue thing has implications that we haven't fully thought through. I think people use the term gospel issue to mean important.
I suggest that in the book, I suggest that the biggest error of our day is expressive individualism. And the counter example to it is the Marines.
Mm-hmm.
And the Marines actually teach you that your identity is found in something larger than yourself for the sake of something other than yourself. And that we have something to say to people about identity, that you cannot find it in yourself. The first move is not down and in. The first move is up and out to commit yourself to something larger than yourself. And the Marines are the secular case study of how one finds a new identity.
Oh, exactly. And it's connection to an institution. It's connection to something outside.
My point. That's right. My point is to say to the magistrate, etc. I would say, or to men, I would simply say, we can start with that insight, which is radically counter to the dominant pervasive view in society today. And I think it's an improvement. Does it get you all the way there? No. Ask any Marine and or hang out with any Marine, and the answer is no. Do they know how to love like Jesus? No. But do they have identity committed to something larger than themselves? Yes. Do they know that their identity is lifelong, namely Semper Fi forever? Oh, once a Marine, always a Marine? Yes. Is that distinctive in all of the service academy or service branches? Yes. And it's also why they are militarily the tip of the spear. The Marines are the expeditionary force. First in.
My dad was a Marine Vietnam era. He was in Vietnam, Purple Heart guy. He told me when he was at Paris Island, the drill instructors told him, they're there. When you leave this island, you will be nothing but a trained killer. That was their.
Right.
But that reminds me of like Full Metal Jacket, which everybody who was in the Marines in that era I've talked to says that's the closest portrayal of what it's like to be in the Marine Corps boot camp of any of them. That point on the island was the Marine Corps doesn't want robots, the Marine Corps wants killers. But so I don't know that we need to be, but I do think that the Marines are very good about instilling their ethos and that sense of identity.
The point being is the question of identity is something larger than yourself. And committed to your brother Marine standing next to you.
And a higher standard to hold yourself to. That's right. It's a bar you have to meet with objective standards.
That's right. Now, my point is to say, I think that if we could instill more of that in our society, that is radically counter to the kind of nihilistic chaos we're seeing in our cities.
I think the last point on that, or another point on that, is with the Marines. That uniform is held in honor in our society. So that's the other component you need to have. They have to act with honor, behave with honor, be a man of honor, but then you also receive honor.
Do you know that a Marine never travels in public in uniform?
Is that true?
Yeah, only when they're on duty. In other words, so I asked a Marine about, getting on planes early. Well, they can show their badge, but you'll never see a Marine unless he is on duty, escorting a body on the plane in uniform.
That's interesting.
Now, it also happens to be the best looking uniform of all the service academies by a long shot.
Right. That is a good looking. That is a good looking uniform there.
I was really curious to know what Space Force would do with their uniform, and they didn't do anything of significance. Because now, I do think that relates to the fact that you need rituals, you need community, you need culture, you need a uniform. I'm a former headmaster of prep schools, and boy, did we emphasize uniforms. And and you could tell what grade you were in roughly by what you were wearing. And the seniors, we had part of the graduation ceremony was putting on their new jacket. In other words, the uniform became a symbol. And a lot of prep schools, the older you are in the school, the more relaxed the uniform gets. I was like, no, just the reverse. And
I
of
think
course, at
also the
Oxford,
Masters winner getting that green jacket.
that's right.
That
That's
means
right.
something. Well, we should probably start wrapping up here. Do you have any final thoughts before we conclude?
Well, I just think that we need a positive vision for masculinity. In other words, something that calls us into the fullness of what we can be in our work and in our relationships and in our identity. And if we see Christ at central in all of them, what happens is we end up with the capability of living a seamless life, and things get integrated in a way that I think is unique and powerful. And I am really allergic to the toxic masculinity narrative because I think men are so important that we need to be celebrating their potential, not in any way undermining them, because as a cultural person, I know that as goes men, so goes families, so goes families, so goes society, so goes society, so goes civilization. It matters. And so this is a book about what can be done at Lake Itasca as it relates to identity of masculinity.
Well, when the book comes out, we'll be sure to share a link to that with our listeners. So,
Well,
John, thank you for.
it is out now, so
Oh, well,
you
then it's going to
can.
have a link to buy it in the show notes. I wish I had known that.
That's right.
I'll be sure to get that in there. So I didn't realize it had come out. I knew you were doing it, but I would have queued that up as the discussion because I actually read the manuscript.
Here it
Oh,
is.
well, there you go.
It's only been out a week, so
Oh,
but
well, there you
yeah.
go. Well, we'll get a link to that in the show notes. We'll feature it prominently.
And on the back cover, there's only one blurb by Aaron Renn.
There you go. Yes, I did get an opportunity to read this. So you should definitely pick up the book because I do commend it. John, thank you so much for joining me. My guest today, John Seel, cultural diagnostician extraordinaire. Thanks again.
Thank you, Aaron.